我的银行账户突然被关掉了，4个账户都在同一家银行，德州的一家银行，是哪家我就不讲了。3个商业账户，1个个人账户突然都被关掉，说45天之后会寄支票给我，有多少余额都寄给我。你知道美国的银行是不稳定的，相信你身边可能也有朋友遇到这样的问题。我最近呢专门跟我的好朋友，也是德克萨斯州的商业律师 Skyler Riddle， 我们聊了一聊银行的问题。我发现他也被关过账户。
How irritated I was, but it really angered me. I'll tell you the story on when we did start the video, but they did it to me the day before I went to China for a month or two for business.
我们今天就来专门说一说美国银行关账户是怎么回事儿，以及你能够做一些什么事情来避免这样的风险呢？So welcome. Scott.
Thank you. It's good to be back, Youngming. Appreciate you inviting me. And I'll say, so my experience is both partially as a customer of banks and also as an attorney. And I'm sure we'll talk about my experience as a customer here in a bit.
As business owners, we all need bank accounts. And
yes.
Any general tips about how to choose the right bank for the
Good question. That's a very good question. So I'll start with my philosophy and just kind of throw it out there. Maybe it'll help folks. So my philosophy in choosing a bank has been to look for a bank that is strong in your region. I prefer smaller banks as opposed to national, larger banks, just because in my experience they work more personable with me. When I go into the bank, they know me by name. They'll sit down and ask about how business is going, and whatnot. I can refer clients to them, and they usually will take care of them if they can. So from a size perspective, I typically go for smaller banks. And the size can vary from local to there's only 1 or 2 in your town, to regional, where it covers a metro area or a region of the U.S., all the way, of course, to national banks, where they're everywhere in the country. And typically, I choose regional banks. So beyond the size issue and the geography, I will also look. I do actually look at whenever I'm opening an account. I do actually look at the bank's public filings. So banks are required to publicly file their asset sheets and information about where their assets are being held, how they're being held, how much money they have in their accounts, and so on. And I do take a look at that. I typically try to choose more conservative banks that will have a larger proportion of their deposits on reserve, which means they have more cash in the bank, essentially, as opposed to things like stocks and bonds and stuff like that, other investments. And I do that just because, obviously, a bank, I don't want my bank, taking risky investments, right? Because it's my money that they're doing it with. I'm looking for a bank that will hold a bigger portion of it so that I don't get into a situation where my money is at risk because of poor decisions by the bank. But luckily in the United States, that hasn't been a large risk in general since the Great Depression, really. There aren't a lot of banks that are failing, and if they do, there are programs that protect depositors for quite a bit. So the risk of that is low, but just me being an attorney and a conservative by nature, I don't want my money at risk. So that's one of the factors I look for. So that's what I would recommend to folks in general. Look at it from a geographic standpoint and convenience for you, and then also just look at how the bank handles your money. And then beyond that, a factor that I typically have not looked at too much is because it's normally I can get what I need locally and regionally. But another factor for people would be convenience in regards to if you're overseas or if you are managing something remotely, business-wise or accounts, then obviously having online banking and having access to certain online banking capabilities is going to be very important to you. So that would be the third factor I would certainly recommend to folks. But there's a huge trend in shifting to digital services. Another interesting change and shift is what's called decentralized finance. I don't know if you're familiar with that, DeFi, right?
Okay.
And it gets kind of thrown around with crypto, which is not exactly crypto, but what it essentially is it is making banking services more accessible to people around the world at a lower cost, and for it to be easier to use. And I think that's really going to be the future for really people around the world. Americans, we're spoiled. We have all of our banking needs taken care of. We can go do stuff anywhere. But frankly, around the world, it is not easy to have a bank and go visit a banker, to have access to bank products like loans or certain types of investments. And decentralized finance hopefully will bring those services and those products to people at a wider scale. So I'm excited about that. I'm really excited about the future of banking and finance. That's not my primary practice area, but I think in the future it's going to be very important for a lot of business owners.
Yeah, I know you are looking for offshore bankings in like Panama.
Yeah.
Why do you need an offshore bank? Because all of your business, most of your business is within the U.S. Why do you need an offshore account?
Good question. This is we're going to get into some interesting topics, I think, with this. So the answer to that is, why do I need it? Frankly, I probably don't. I could do everything I need to in the United States, but the way that I see the world, the way that I like to handle risk, and I analyze the risk that I take or that my money takes, I like to have a wider perspective on the world, have a wider footprint in the world, a wider footprint in regards to my holdings, my finance, my banking. So that is the primary reason for me personally why I like to bank internationally as well, because I see that there are significant geopolitical risks with having all of your funds, all of your income, all of your assets in one country or even one bank, or in one region potentially, and even in one currency. That's another, the dollar is changing, right? And its impact around the world is changing very quickly. So me as an American, I need to take steps to make sure that I'm not locked out of certain regions of the world and certain business investments around the world just because I want to use the dollar. I got to learn to adapt and work around the world with people from a multitude of backgrounds. So that's the primary reason why I would do that. So a reason why potentially our listeners or the audience would be interested would be from a risk factor as well. If they feel like their home country or their assets they're holding may be at a certain risk portfolio that's unacceptable, or they feel like there's too much risk, offshore banking can help lower those risks, whether that's from potential lawsuits or business in the U.S., or from their home country if they want to diversify out of that country or even a currency. So really, for our listeners, it would be based on a risk analysis is why they would explore international banking or offshore banking.
Is there any specific reason that you are looking at Panama?
For me personally, I like Panama a lot because it has the Panama Canal. Obviously, it's a major trade hub for the Americas, and it connects Asia to Europe, Asia to Africa, and of course both coasts of the Americas. So it has a fantastic geography. What's interesting is that it has its own currency, but that currency is pegged to the dollar, which is good and bad in some respects. But what it does is that for people who are using the U.S. dollar, it essentially eliminates exchange rate risks, what's called arbitrage. You won't risk losing a portion of your fees or your funds or whatever because of fees or costs associated with transferring your money. So geography, I like their business laws. They have very pro-business attitude and atmosphere there. They welcome investment. What's really fantastic, too, I think, is that they have a free trade agreement with the United States, and they are actually in the 5th or 6th round of negotiations with China to have a free trade agreement with China. And I'm hoping that they work with China and complete that in the near future. And I think that will really position them as a power player to have a trade agreement with two of the largest markets in the entire world that they can do business with very low cost and at a competitive advantage to anyone else, will really make them attractive from a business standpoint.
As you already
Sure,
know,
sure.
my bank accounts have been shut down recently for whatever reason. I don't know. I tried to call them this morning and they didn't answer the phone, so I don't know. And I know you have similar experience.
Yeah, so let's dig into the why. I'll tell my personal story with it after. So the why, this is going to be a bit of a long, winding road here, but essentially the United States over the last 40 years has been implementing what we refer to as anti-money laundering legislation, anti-money laundering laws and regulations. It started in the 70s with the Bank Secrecy Act. Then the next big one was the U.S. Patriot Act in 2001. And then actually this year we passed another one. I forget the name of it. I think it's the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, something like that. Very generic. But that has also brought in a whole new slate of rules and regulations. So generally, those laws, those rules and regulations have laid out obligations, requirements to banks and to institutions or businesses that handle money. So banks, currency exchangers are covered by these laws. Money remitters, so that's companies like Western Union or Zelle, I think is one. Those companies at MoneyGram who send money across borders. All of them are covered. Securities brokers, oddly enough, are covered as well. In many countries, the United States not yet, but probably in the near future. But most countries, attorneys are also covered by that. They have to follow these rules and regulations. So that's what the rules. That's where the rules came from. That's who it affects. Now let's get into what the rules are. And basically, what it does is that it requires banks and money businesses to know who their customer is. That's the term, KYC. Know your customer.
Okay.
And what that requires is that a banker needs to know who you are. They need to verify it. They need to know what you're doing. They need to verify that. And then they have to do what's called a risk analysis. They need to look at who you are, what you're doing, and whether there is risk that you potentially could be breaking either anti-money laundering laws or breaking a policy of the bank or involved in something else that is too risky for the bank's portfolio or for the bank's customer list. And that is very general. That's very in a gist what is happening. And what happens to individuals like yourself and even myself in the past is that our activities are not typically our identities, but maybe an aspect of our identity, but usually it's because of our activities. Some type of activities that we're undertaking as a business or as an individual will raise red flags with the bank and their anti-money laundering department. And once those red flags are raised, if we don't have, if you answer questions the wrong way, or you submit documentation that they feel is too risky, you fit a certain risk portfolio, they will then take steps to close your accounts. So, yeah. So that is in a gist what has happened. Now, I'll tell you what's very frustrating for you, as you have experienced, as I have experienced, and as lots of folks have experienced, is that banks are not allowed to tell you why they're closing your account. They're not allowed to tell you when they file reports. So, as a quick aside, whenever you do something that raises your risk profile with the bank, typically that's a transaction in the United States, the bank or that money business will need to file a suspicious activity report, an SAR, or sometimes called an STR, suspicious transaction report, to the U.S. federal government. So they file reports on you, and the banks are not allowed to tell you that they file these reports. They're not allowed to tell you that you don't fit their risk profile. They're not allowed to tell you why they're closing your account. So there is a wall of secrecy, essentially, between customers, what they're experiencing, and the bank's policy decisions. And it's extremely frustrating when you're on the other side of that wall and you don't get answers. But unfortunately, that's the way that our banking system has developed to address anti-money laundering risks.
Will this report affect my business in the future?
Good question. Probably not. No. So there are tens of thousands of SARs and STRs reports filed every year to the federal government. A fraction of them, I don't recall exactly, but something like 0.5% or something are ever actually used in a proceeding, some type of criminal or civil proceeding. So it doesn't mean that anything's going to happen to you, but what it means is that it's on file. And if in the future, if there are a certain number of other reports that are filed, or if for whatever reason there's some type of an investigation about you, whether criminal or civil, the federal government and other government entities will have access to those reports and to see more information about you. So it's not used typically to reach out and grab people or to accuse them of something. It's used later by law enforcement typically.
I see. So for a business owner, we need obviously we need a backup plan.
The simplest, of course, is to have bank accounts at multiple banks. That's what I have, a couple different bank accounts at different banks. Of course, I like to do mine locally, obviously, and regionally. Nationally, it's always great to have some accounts at a national level as well. Those are going to be your baseline backup plan, right? Have multiple accounts across different banks, and they don't necessarily all have to be business accounts. You can open up a personal account at a national bank and just use that personal account, and then have your business account somewhere local. And should it become necessary, then you can go back to your national bank and say, hey, I need to open a business account, and they can usually do that rather quickly for you because they already know who you are, they're already working with you, and you can do that in a much more streamlined manner. So even just having your personal accounts and your business accounts in different banks is typically a good step. Beyond that, I know we've talked a little bit ago about offshore banking.
Yeah.
Diversifying overseas is always a good idea. And even diversifying outside of banks. And what I mean by that is if you have a business that is generating certain types of revenue, that you don't necessarily need a brick and mortar location and credit cards in hand, you can utilize other fintech options. There are things like PayPal, what I mentioned earlier, Plasma Pay is one that's used outside the U.S., Revolut. There's others that will process payments for you, and you don't necessarily need a business bank account with them. Oh, another one is Wise, which used to be TransferWise. I've used that to work with folks internationally. So, excuse me. So beyond diversifying amongst many banks, also diversifying among different types of fintech or financial institutions.